In the black, rain-lashed jungle of Guadalcanal, the world has shrunk to the mud in front of your face and the terrifying chatter of a machine gun. It is October 24th, 1942. For the men of the 1st Marine Division, this is the edge of existence. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, it is the culmination of a journey through hell, a final desperate charge into a wall of steel. Waves of men, their uniforms shredded, their bodies skeletal from starvation, hurl themselves against American barbed wire. They are met by a symphony of destruction. Pre-sighted mortars walk explosions across the jungle floor. Machine guns, like John Basiloni's, spit a ceaseless stream of fire, scything through the tall kunai grass. The night is illuminated by the flash of artillery and the frantic glare of amphibious tractor headlights, transforming the battlefield into a ghostly, horrifying stage. This was the climax of the battle for Henderson Field, a battle that would see over 20,000 Japanese soldiers perish on this single God-forsaken island. The history books record it as a great American victory, a testament to the tenacity of the United States Marine. And that is true. But it is not the whole truth. Because the question that hangs over this bloody night is not simply how the Americans won. The real question is how an elite, battle-hardened Japanese army, an army that had conquered half of Asia, that was feared across the globe for its fanatical courage, could be so utterly and catastrophically annihilated. The answer is shocking, because this battle wasn't truly won in the mud and blood of the perimeter. It was lost weeks before, in a decision born of fatal arrogance. It was lost to an enemy far more relentless than the Marines. This is the story of how 24,000 men were defeated not by bullets, but by a map. It's the story of how the greatest weapon against the Japanese wasn't a rifle, but the jungle itself. To understand the disaster that was about to unfold on Guadalcanal, you must first understand the myth of the invincible Japanese soldier. In early 1942, the Empire of Japan was a terrifying and seemingly unstoppable force. The rising sun flew over a vast new empire, carved out with breathtaking speed and ferocity. They had humiliated the British at Singapore, forcing the largest surrender of British-led military personnel in history. They had driven the Americans out of the Philippines, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March. They had conquered Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Their soldiers were seen as superhuman warriors, masters of jungle warfare, imbued with the unshakable spirit of Bushido, a code that demanded death before dishonor. They were veterans of brutal campaigns in China, hardened by years of combat. Allied propaganda painted them as jungle phantoms, capable of moving silently through the densest terrain, living off the land, and fighting to the last man. And for a time, this myth was terrifyingly real. The strategic heart of this new southern empire was the massive naval and air base at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. From here, Japan could project power across the South Pacific. To protect this fortress, they needed to create a defensive perimeter, a shield of island air bases. They crept down through the Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base on the small island of Tulagi. And then, their eyes fell on the island just across the water, a 90-mile-long, 25-mile-wide slab of volcanic rock and impenetrable jungle called Guadalcanal. In July of 1942, Japanese construction units landed at a place called Lunga Point and began carving an airfield out of the coconut groves. For the Allies, this was an existential threat. Once operational, that airfield would be a dagger pointed at the vital supply lines connecting America to Australia. It could sever the lifeline of the entire Pacific War. It could not be allowed to stand. The American High Command, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, made a bold, desperate gamble. Operation Watchtower. It would be America's first major ground offensive of the entire war. The tip of the spear would be the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift. They were tough, they were disciplined, but they were green. Few had ever heard a shot fired in anger. On August 7, 1942, against all expectations, the landings were a stunning success. 11,000 Marines stormed ashore at Lunga Point and met almost no resistance. The 2,800 Japanese personnel on the island, mostly Korean and Japanese laborers, fled into the jungle. Within a day, the Marines had captured the prize, the nearly completed airfield. They promptly named it Henderson Field in honor of a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. They established a defensive perimeter around the airfield, digging in along the beaches and along a sluggish, crocodile-infested river the Marines nicknamed Alligator Creek. But their triumph was short-lived. Just 2 nights later, a powerful Japanese naval force under Admiral Gunichi Mikawa steamed down the Slot and, in the Battle of Savo Island, delivered one of the most crushing defeats in the history of the U.S. Navy. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom of the sea. Fearing for his aircraft carriers, the American naval commander pulled his entire fleet out. The transport ships, with half their cargo still unloaded, went with them. Suddenly, Vandergrift's Marines were utterly alone, stranded. They were orphans on Guadalcanal, with limited food, limited ammunition, and the full might of the Japanese Empire preparing to smash them. The stage was set for a desperate defense. The world watched, expecting the invincible Japanese Army to sweep the green American Marines back into the sea. The myth was about to collide with a brutal, unforgiving reality. The Japanese High Command in Rabaul was incensed. The idea that mere American Marines could seize Imperial territory was an intolerable insult. They responded with the same contemptuous arrogance that had defined their early victories. They drastically underestimated the number of Marines on the island, believing only a few thousand were present. The first counterattack was assigned to a man who embodied the spirit of the Imperial Army, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. He commanded an elite detachment of 900 soldiers, veterans who had fought at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the event that sparked the Second Sino-Japanese War. Confident to the point of suicidal, Ichiki famously declared he had no need for artillery. His men would simply charge and annihilate the Americans with bayonets. On the night of August 21st, he did just that. At Alligator Creek, Ichiki's men launched wave after wave of frontal assaults directly into the teeth of the Marine defenses. Shouting Banzai, they charged into the interlocking fields of fire from Marine machine guns. The result was not a battle, it was a slaughter. By morning, almost 800 of Ichiki's 900 men lay dead. The Marines, with the help of light tanks, systematically hunted down and killed the rest. Ichiki, in disgrace, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide. It was a shocking defeat, but the Japanese High Command failed to learn the correct lesson. They did not see a failure of tactics or intelligence. They saw only a failure of numbers. They believed Ichiki had lost simply because his force was too small. So, they sent a larger one. This time, a force of over 5,000 men under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi was a more cunning commander. He avoided a direct frontal assault, landing his men east of the perimeter and planning to attack from the south, through the jungle. He targeted a long, grassy ridge that formed the southern spine of the Marine defenses, a place that would forever be known as Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. For 2 hellish nights in mid-September, Kawaguchi's men hurled themselves against the thinly held lines of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson's raiders and parachute battalions. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a desperate, chaotic struggle in the dark. But again, the result was the same. Marine discipline and devastatingly accurate artillery fire shattered the Japanese attacks. Kawaguchi's force was broken, suffering enormous casualties. Here, now, was the critical moment, the turning point. The Japanese had twice attacked the American perimeter and had been twice annihilated. They had clear, bloody evidence that the Marines were more numerous, better equipped, and more resilient than they had believed. They had proof that simple frontal assaults, no matter how bravely executed, were suicidal against prepared defenses supported by artillery. This was the moment for a reassessment, a moment for humility. Instead, the High Command doubled down on their arrogance. They assembled their largest force yet, under the command of Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army. He would personally oversee an offensive to finally, once and for all, wipe Henderson Field off the map. And he approved a plan that was born from the exact same flawed logic as Kawaguchi's, but on a far grander and far more catastrophic scale. The main striking force, 7,000 men of the veteran 2nd Sendai Division, under Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would not attack from the east or west. They would undertake an epic flanking march, cutting a 20-mile trail deep into the supposedly impassable jungle south of the perimeter, and attack from where the Americans least expected it. This was the decision. This was the inciting incident. This was the first domino to fall in a chain reaction of disaster. On paper, it looked brilliant. A classic maneuver of envelopment. Japanese intelligence, based on flimsy reconnaissance, insisted the jungle was undefended and the terrain, while difficult, was manageable. Their maps showed a tangle of green, but they failed to show the sheer verticality of the ridges, the depth of the swamps, the suffocating thickness of the vegetation. They were so confident of victory that they set the date for the attack, October 22nd, and designated the code word for when American resistance collapsed: Banzai. They weren't just planning a battle. They were planning a victory parade. They had no idea they were sending thousands of their best men not on a march to glory, but on a death march. The story of the battle for Henderson Field is not the story of the final assault. It is the story of the march that preceded it. This is the autopsy of a military disaster. On October 16th, General Maruyama's force plunged into the jungle. It was immediately apparent that their maps were a fantasy. This was not merely difficult terrain. It was what Marines would later call a green hell. The trail they had to cut was not over rolling hills, but up and down a series of sheer, razor-backed ridges and deep, swampy ravines. The jungle canopy was so thick it created a perpetual twilight, and the rain was constant. The ground became a sucking, glutinous morass of mud that pulled at men's boots and swallowed equipment whole. Each soldier began the march carrying his rifle, ammunition, and a single artillery shell for the big guns that were supposed to support their attack. The weapons crews had it worse, hauling the disassembled pieces of their heavy howitzers and cannons. Within days, the logistical plan, fragile to begin with, completely disintegrated. The heavy artillery, the very weapons they needed to smash the American defenses, proved impossible to move. The exhausted crews strained to drag the guns up muddy slopes, only to watch them slide back down. One by one, the cannons were abandoned, left to rust in the jungle. The soldiers, already on reduced rations, found their food supplies rotting in the constant damp. They ate what they could: coconuts, snails, roots, Soon they were eating grass and leaves. Disease set in. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged the column. Men grew weak, their bodies racked with fever and hunger. The single-file line of 7,000 elite soldiers stretched for miles, a crawling, suffering serpent of humanity. They held their rifles over their heads to wade through chest-deep rivers, infested with crocodiles. Leeches clung to their bodies. The sharp kunai grass sliced their skin, leaving cuts that quickly became infected in the filth. This was no longer an army on the march. It was a column of ghosts, stumbling through a nightmare. Communication between units broke down. The attack, scheduled for October 22nd, had to be postponed. Then postponed again. Maruyama sent a desperate message to General Hyakutake. His forces were not in position. They were scattered, exhausted, and starving. Meanwhile, at the Matanakau River on the western edge of the perimeter, a smaller Japanese force under Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi was tasked with creating a diversion. As planned, on the evening of October 23rd, they launched their attack. 9 Japanese tanks rumbled forward across a sandbar at the river's mouth, expecting to punch through the Marine line. But the Marines were ready. 37mm anti-tank guns, perfectly positioned, opened fire. One after another, the tanks were knocked out, brewing up in flames. The accompanying infantry charge was shredded by machine gun and artillery fire. The diversion had failed utterly. And yet, despite the failure of the diversion and the desperate state of his main force, Maruyama gave the order to attack on the night of the 24th. His men, after more than a week in the green hell, finally emerged from the jungle. They were not the proud warriors of the Sendai Division. They were skeletal figures, their eyes hollow, their strength gone. They arrived at the edge of the American perimeter not as a cohesive, powerful army, but as a starving, disorganized mob. And what they saw must have broken their hearts. They weren't facing a thinly held line in the jungle. They were facing a fortress. The Americans, commanded by legends like Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller, had spent weeks preparing. They had strung thousands of yards of barbed wire. They had dug deep foxholes and machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. Most importantly, the 11th Marine Artillery Regiment had pre-registered every square inch of the terrain in front of them. They didn't need to see the enemy. They just needed a grid coordinate to bring down a steel rain of high explosives. The autopsy of the battle itself is swift and brutal. That night and the next, Maruyama's starving soldiers threw themselves against the American lines, held by Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment, fighting side by side. The Japanese attacks were acts of incredible suicidal bravery. They managed to breach the wire in some places, leading to savage, close-quarters fighting. It was here that men like Gunnery Sergeant John Basiloni became legends. When 2 of his machine gun crews were knocked out, Basiloni, a bull of a man, hoisted a 90-pound machine gun and sprinted through enemy fire to get it back into action. He ran ammunition, cleared jams, and fought off Japanese soldiers with his pistol, keeping his guns firing all night long, forming a bulwark against which the Japanese attacks broke and failed. But individual heroism was not the deciding factor. The battle was decided by systems. It was the American system of defense in depth, of integrated artillery, of barbed wire, and of superior firepower that annihilated the Japanese. By the morning of October 26th, it was over. The jungle in front of the American lines was carpeted with the bodies of over 2,000 Japanese soldiers. In that final bloody assault, the Americans suffered just 86 killed. The ripple effect of this single catastrophic failure was immense. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end on Guadalcanal. They had thrown their best troops at Henderson Field, and they had been broken. The island became what they called the Island of Death, a meat grinder that would consume thousands more men, not in glorious battle, but through starvation and disease. Of the 31,000 Japanese soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, 24,000 would die. It was a wound from which the Imperial Japanese Army would never fully recover, bleeding them of veteran troops and equipment they could not replace. For the United States, the victory at Henderson Field was a profound turning point. It proved that the American fighting man, be he Marine or Army soldier, could stand up to the legendary Japanese soldier and win. It secured the vital lifeline to Australia, and it provided a brutal, bloody education in the realities of jungle warfare, lessons that would be paid for in blood, but would ultimately pave the path to Tokyo. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in the mud south of Henderson Field. When the fighting on Guadalcanal finally ended in February 1943, the island was a graveyard. The shattered remnants of Japan's 17th Army were evacuated, but they left behind their dead, their abandoned equipment, and the ghost of their empire's ambition. The campaign was a strategic pivot point in the Pacific War. It was the first time the Japanese were decisively beaten on land, marking the end of their expansion and the beginning of a long, bloody retreat. The legacy of Guadalcanal is etched into the very identity of the United States Marine Corps. The shabby leathernecks of the 1st Marine Division, as they were called, became icons of American resilience. Names like Vandergrift, Edson, Puller, and Basilone became enshrined in military history. The battle forged a reputation for toughness against impossible odds that endures to this day. Henderson Field itself, the prize for which so many fought and died, is now Honiara International Airport, the main gateway to the Solomon Islands, a peaceful hub of commerce and travel on ground consecrated by blood. But the story of the October Offensive offers a lesson that transcends this one battle, this one war. It is a timeless and universal cautionary tale about the mortal danger of hubris. It demonstrates, in the starkest terms possible, that courage and fighting spirit, no matter how immense, are no substitute for sound logistics and accurate intelligence. The Japanese High Command believed so strongly in the innate superiority and spiritual strength of their soldiers that they became blind to the physical realities of the battlefield. They saw the jungle on a map as an opportunity, a corridor for a clever maneuver, failing to recognize it as the primary enemy, an impartial force of nature that would starve, sicken, and exhaust an army into impotence. The battle for Henderson Field was not a contest between the American soldier and the Japanese soldier. It was a contest between two military doctrines. One, pragmatic, engineering-focused, and reliant on overwhelming, systematically applied firepower. The other, ideological, contemptuous of logistics, and reliant on the mystical power of spirit. In the green hell of Guadalcanal, pragmatism won. The jungle did not care about Bushido. The artillery did not care about Banzai charges. This story is a powerful reminder that wars are often won and lost long before the first shot is fired, in the planning rooms, on the supply lines, and in the crucial, often fatal gap between perception and reality. The 24,000 dead are a monument to a plan that was doomed from its very inception. What do you think was the single greatest mistake made by the Japanese command in the Guadalcanal campaign? Was it their intelligence, their logistics, or their fundamental underestimation of the American will to fight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into history compelling, be sure to like this video Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.